So this will be a little shorter than the last video. I know I say that every time, but I do genuinely think this one will be a little bit more brief. I want to talk about racial stratification or racial inequality. Just conceptually, I want to give you guys a couple of things to keep in mind when we talk about the consequences of the intersection of racial categories and the distribution of resources like income, wealth, power, right? Those sorts of things. So when we describe racial stratification or ethnic stratification or racial inequality or ethnic inequality, again, those words are kind of interchangeable to some degree. We're really talking about a pattern under which inequality falls along the lines of race or ethnicity. So when we talked about stratification earlier, we talked about the layers that make up a society. Those layers consist of people who share a similar set of economic circumstances, income or wealth or power. Some of the stratification systems that we've seen in the past have been what we call closed systems. That means that there is no possibility for social mobility between these various layers. Open systems, which we also sometimes call social class systems, they emerge with industrialization, and the modern stratification systems that we find in the United States and other similar countries are what we would call open systems or social class systems. They're stratification systems, but they're distinguished from, say, for example, feudalism or caste systems or other kinds of closed mobility stratification systems. So when we look at inequality itself, we see that inequality is not equally distributed, if you follow, right? So we have a system, a stratification system, a social class system that allows us to describe upper class people, middle class people, working class people, and lower class people, or capitalists and workers, depending on whether we're talking about socioeconomic status or power. What we haven't talked about yet is the degree to which certain categories of people, racial categories for our purposes, but in just a bit, we're going to be talking about the way this works with sex and gender as well. But we see that that people of color are overrepresented among the working class and the lower class, right? So proportionally, if economic inequality had no racial component, then the proportion of rich people, right, people in the upper class, would reflect the overall proportion of racial groups within the population. So African Americans, for example, are roughly 13% of the U.S. population. So if inequality were not sort of intersecting with race, then about 13% of the wealthiest people in our society would be Black. 13% of the poorest people in our society would be Black. 13% of the middle class people in our society would be Black. So you follow where I'm going with this. But that's not the case, right? We know that Blacks are overrepresented among the poor. People of Latin American descent are overrepresented among the poor. And so we talk about racial or ethnic stratification or racial and ethnic inequality so that we can sort of explore the way in which those sort of categories are interacting with one another. The most rigid of these systems would be a racial caste system. A racial caste system is a system of social inequality with two or sometimes more rigidly defined and unequal groups. The membership in those groups is determined by one's birth, and thus gets passed down from generation to generation. So in the United States, chattel slavery, which was the system that replaced indentured servitude. Chattel slavery is a racial caste system, right? That white people are not slaves, black people are slaves, right? That's basically the criteria for inclusion in one of the other categories. You do not change the circumstances of your birth. And as a result of that, of course, you never escape slavery if you're a slave, because you can't become white over the course of your life, which is the group of people to whom chattel slavery is not going to be a condition that they experience. So when we talk about racial caste systems, that's what we mean. We mean a very rigidly defined system of social inequality. Now, we could certainly, I hope, agree and get most people to see the reasoning behind the assertion that chattel slavery is a race-based caste system, a racial caste system. I would also argue that Jim Crow is a similarly rigid racial caste system. It's a little less rigid because many of the institutional mechanisms that could be used to keep black people in chattel slavery are eradicated through the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution in the wake of the Civil War. Nevertheless, from about 1877 until 1965, we see a system in which legal racial segregation is not just present, it's actually protected by law, right? So the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson establishes the notion that separate but equal is in fact completely consistent with the U.S. Constitution and with the 14th Amendment, and especially its Equal Protection Clause, even though in practical terms, obviously, Jim Crow systems of racial segregation clearly disadvantaged people of color while granting benefits and privileges to whites as a group. So even after chattel slavery, we can still see the Jim Crow era through that lens of a kind of racial caste system with a similar degree of inflexibility and rigidity, although again, a little bit more bleeding at the edges, a little bit less rigid, but still nevertheless closer to a caste system than to a social class system. I think that's fair to say. And of course, one of the things that makes this work is the concept of segregation. And this is the last concept I want to introduce to you guys. Segregation is the separation of two groups into separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate workplaces, etc., etc. It can be the result of open and deliberate policies that call for segregation. So again, prior to 1965, or maybe 1954, we begin to see it eroding in the 1950s and sort of reaches the end of its sort of legal protections in the mid-60s with the Civil Rights Act. But prior to that, right, we see laws that require racial segregation and that give it the blessing of sort of constitutionality. We would call that de jure segregation. De jure is just a Latin term. It means by law or by policy. Subtler ways to create segregation that are not rooted in law, but are perhaps, for example, the legacy of previous patterns of legal segregation, we would call that de facto segregation. So de facto just means in practice. So if you remove the restrictions on access to higher education that had previously been in place for people of color, and you say we're just going to go with an admissions policy based on educational qualifications alone, but you have a concentration of people of color among the poor, and as a result of that, the public schools that they attend trend toward being underfunded, relative to schools in more affluent and thus more white communities, you're going to see that whites and blacks arrive, at their post-secondary educational stage, right? They graduate high school. Whites as a group are going to be in a better position to compete for admission to colleges and universities than blacks or Latinos or something like that, right? So segregation can be perpetuated in that way because one of the mechanisms for social mobility, one of the ways that a person can move up and transcend sort of the social circumstances and the socioeconomic status into which they're born is through education. And if people don't have equal access to that because of the legacy of previous patterns of racial segregation and racial discrimination, then they're going to end up perpetuating that inequality. You're going to have a group that remains relatively locked into conditions of relative poverty and relative deprivation. So understanding, again, one of the things that I think is becoming abundantly clear as you sort of study a sociological approach to making sense of the social world is the degree to which all of this stuff is kind of interconnected, right? That we don't start anew every generation, that there's the the pressure and the weight of history sort of leaning on us from the past and determining a lot of the conditions under which people operate in the present, which itself will have an impact on what happens in subsequent generations. So this is a theme that you can see quite clearly when you study something like the intersection of race and ethnicity with social and economic inequality. So again, I hope that's clear. And of course, if it's not, please feel free to reach out and ask questions. And until the next time, I'll say have a good one.